Ethan Crawford had never seen the house before the day he inherited it. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion, nestled on a forgotten hill beyond the outskirts of town. Its once brilliant facade was now faded and chipped, as if time itself had abandoned it. When he first approached, the wind moaned through the leafless trees, carrying with it an unsettling chill that made his skin prickle. Yet, there was something about the mansion that drew him forward, a magnetic pull he could not resist. The door creaked with a sound that seemed almost alive, groaning as though the house were inhaling his presence. Inside, dust motes danced in the thin rays of sunlight that dared to enter through the heavy curtains. Each room bore the weight of years unvisited. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, cobwebs hung like fragile curtains from the chandeliers, and the walls were lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him with quiet judgment. As Ethan explored, he could not shake the sensation that he was being watched. The mansion seemed to breathe with him, each step on the creaking floorboards echoing unnaturally. He passed through the drawing room, where a cracked mirror reflected a faint, distorted version of himself, and then into the grand hallway, where shadows pooled in corners and stretched across the walls, shifting with a life of their own. It was there, in that long, narrow corridor, that he first heard the whispers. At first, they were no more than a soft rustle, like the wind passing through dry leaves. But gradually they took shape, forming words that seemed to slip just beyond his full understanding. He stopped, heart hammering, listening intently. The whispers came again, clearer this time. "He never left, he can't leave. Don't listen to him." Ethan's pulse quickened. He could not tell whether the voice was real or a figment of his imagination. Yet the words tugged at something deep within him, a mixture of dread and curiosity he could not resist. Step by step, he followed the whispers down the corridor, past doors that appeared untouched for decades. The air grew colder with each footfall, and the shadows seemed to thicken, forming shapes that stretched toward him, almost beckoning. He entered the library, a room filled with towering shelves of leather-bound books and forgotten journals. The whispers grew more insistent, and as he moved closer to a small desk at the far end, a journal slid from the top of a pile and fell open at his feet. The writing was jagged, hurried, as if penned by a hand desperate to confide its secrets. The words told of a man who had once lived in the mansion, a tenant who had disappeared without a trace. Strange occurrences haunted him. Doors closing by themselves, voices echoing in the dead of night, shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too long, and an ever-growing feeling that the house hungered for more than just life. It hungered for fear. Ethan shivered, reading on despite the chill that raced down his spine. The journal spoke of whispers, of a presence that could mimic voices, a being that fed on terror until the victim was no more than a trembling shadow of themselves. He glanced around, suddenly aware that the air seemed thick, almost viscous, pressing against his chest. The whispers returned, now a chorus of voices, overlapping, speaking secrets he was not sure he wanted to know. "He sees you, he wants you, the walls remember." As he backed toward the door, a shadow slithered across the floor, fast and sinuous, brushing against his leg. Panic surged through him, yet he could not move. The mansion seemed to tighten around him, its walls bending, stretching as though alive, feeding off his fear. Every creak, every groan of the old house, felt intentional, like a predator toying with its prey. Ethan fled the library and stumbled into the hallway once more. The whispers now became voices he could not ignore, repeating names, dates, and memories that were not his own. The house was speaking to him, guiding him, or perhaps warning him. But warning of what? He could not tell, for the mansion was a labyrinth of echoing sounds and shifting shadows. Each turn revealed new corners filled with dark shapes that seemed to stretch toward him, impossibly long, impossibly alive. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had begun to lose its meaning in this cursed place. The whispers grew insistent, almost pleading. "Stay, stay, we've chosen you." Ethan realized with a sinking horror that he had not wandered here by chance. The mansion had called to him, sensed his presence, and now it would not let him go. His fear made it stronger, more aware, more patient, as it slithered through the halls, waiting for him to falter. By the time night fell, the mansion was no longer a house but a living entity, writhing and whispering, pressing against him from every wall, floor, and ceiling. Ethan was trapped in a web of sound and shadow, each whisper drilling deeper into his mind. He tried to run, tried to leave, but the mansion had already chosen him, and its hunger could not be denied. The shadows now danced more boldly, forming vague human shapes that watched him with hollow eyes. He understood with a clarity that made his blood run cold, that the whispers were not memories or ghosts. They were the mansion itself, speaking, feeling, feeding. They had guided him here, observed him, and now they waited for his surrender. Every step he took brought him closer to the truth, and closer to becoming part of the house's ever-growing collection of fear. By the dim flicker of candlelight, Ethan's hands shook as he tried to steady himself. Every shadow around him pulsed with life, stretching and contracting, forming shapes that seemed both familiar and impossibly alien. The whispers now spoke with an authority he could not resist, guiding him deeper into the mansion's heart. Each word felt like a command, each sound a tether tightening around his soul. The mansion's interior became more surreal with every step. Staircases twisted in impossible directions, doors appeared where none had been before, and the air itself felt thick, heavy, almost viscous. The shadows coalesced into a dark figure at the end of the corridor. Its face was obscured, yet its presence was undeniable, a sentinel guarding the house's deepest secrets. "You've come," the figure whispered, voice echoing like 1,000 others at once. "You belong here now." Ethan tried to speak, to plead, to fight, but words failed him. His fear had become the mansion's lifeblood, and it thrived on every shiver, every gasp, every thought of escape. He realized then that the mansion was not haunted. It was the haunter. The previous tenant had not vanished. He had been claimed, absorbed into the house's very essence, a collection of whispers and shadows that guided new prey to their doom. The candlelight flickered violently, and for a moment, Ethan saw the countless faces of those who had come before him. They were trapped in the shadows, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow yet watchful. He felt their despair, their terror, and their warning, but it was too late. The mansion had him now. Its hunger was sated only temporarily, for it required more, always more, and Ethan was its newest offering. The whispers wrapped around him, intimate and suffocating. "Do you see? Do you feel? You are chosen. You are the next." The shadows moved closer, wrapping around his legs, climbing his arms, seeping into his mind. Every attempt to resist was met with a surge of oppressive force, like the house itself were pressing its will into him, bending him toward inevitable surrender. Ethan stumbled into the grand ballroom, a place that seemed impossibly vast, its ceiling vanishing into darkness. Chandeliers swung as if moved by invisible hands, their crystals scattering fractured light across the room. He could hear the echoes of laughter and cries, memories of joy and terror trapped within the walls. The mansion was a living memory, feeding off every emotion, and now it had singled him out. He could feel its hunger crawling beneath his skin, whispering promises he did not want to hear. A sense of inevitability settled over him. He understood that the house did not just hold spirits or memories, it held life itself. Those who had entered and vanished were not lost. They were transformed, absorbed into the mansion's essence, their whispers joining the chorus that had guided him here. And now his voice would join theirs, a new thread in the tapestry of fear that stretched through every hallway, every shadow, every brick of the mansion. Ethan fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the presence of the house, by the suffocating weight of its sentience. His own whispers began to emerge, mingling with the others, recounting his terror, his confusion, his surrender. He realized then that resistance was futile. The mansion had chosen, and it had claimed. He could feel his identity slipping, his will dissolving into the greater consciousness of the house. As dawn approached, The house stood silent, serene, and deceptively still from the outside. The hill was quiet, the wind carrying no hint of the horrors within. Yet inside, the mansion thrived, alive with whispers, shadows, and the constant hunger that would never be sated. Ethan Crawford's presence had been absorbed. His fear transformed into nourishment for the mansion's ever-watchful soul. And so it waited, patient and eternal, ready for the next to heed its call. The house had chosen, and it would choose again. Story number 2. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Clara found herself alone in her attic, sorting through boxes left behind by the previous owner of the old Victorian house she had inherited. The rain tapped gently against the slanted roof, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that made the dust in the room dance in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy window. Amidst piles of forgotten belongings and brittle yellowed newspapers, her eyes landed on a portrait leaning against the far wall, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten quilt. The frame was ornate, gilded with intricate carvings of twisting vines and small, almost imperceptible faces, like the whispers of some secret history pressed into the wood. The canvas within held the image of a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9, dressed in a pale blue dress with delicate lace trimming. Her expression was solemn, almost too serious for a child so young, and her eyes were large, dark, and haunting. Something about them caught Clara's attention immediately. They seemed to hold a quiet intelligence, a secret that was not meant for her. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the way her mind insisted on turning the girl's gaze toward her as she moved about the attic. She chuckled softly, the sound echoing strangely in the cramped space, and reached forward to touch the frame. The surface was cold, almost damp beneath her fingers, as if the air around it had condensed into something unnatural. She shivered, pulling back, yet could not tear her eyes away from those dark, patient eyes that seemed to watch her every move. Over the following days, Clara began to notice small, unsettling occurrences. Objects in her home would shift ever so slightly, never in ways that made sense, never enough to suggest an intruder. A cup she had left on the kitchen counter would be on the window sill when she returned. A book would fall open to a page she had never read, and she would swear she heard a soft giggle, light and teasing, drifting from the shadows of her house. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Creaking floors, the wind, the mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being observed grew heavier with each passing hour. Sleep brought no relief. Each night, she found herself dreaming of the girl in the portrait. The dreams were vivid, suffocatingly real, and always began the same way. A small voice crying softly in the darkness, a wet, ragged sound that made Clara's chest tighten. She would follow the sound through twisting corridors, down hallways that did not exist in her house, until she found the girl, standing alone in a room she could never find in waking life. The girl's eyes, always the same, would meet hers with a pleading intensity that clawed at her sanity. One particularly stormy evening, the wind howling like a chorus of wailing ghosts against the windows, Clara returned to the attic. Lightning flashed, illuminating the portrait in sudden bursts of stark white, and the thunder shook the house as though it wished to awaken something long dormant. She felt compelled, drawn forward by a force she could not name, and approached the frame with trembling hands. It was then she noticed the first impossible change. The girl in the portrait was shifting, subtly at first, then undeniably. Her features began to grow more mature, the fine lines of childhood fading into the soft curves of adolescence, yet it was not moving forward in age, but backward, as though the girl were unliving her own life. The eyes, dark and deep, were alive with movement, tracking Clara's every step with increasing urgency. Clara stumbled backward, heart hammering, but fascination rooted her to the spot. She lifted a trembling hand to her own reflection in a nearby mirror and recoiled in horror. Her face seemed wrong. Shadows clung too heavily to her skin. Her eyes were sharper, darker, and her reflection no longer mirrored her perfectly. The line between her living self and the painted girl blurred, and Clara felt a creeping, suffocating terror, the realization that perhaps she was no longer fully separate from the girl in the portrait. That night sleep did not come. She remained in her bedroom, the storm raging outside, listening to the faint giggles and whispers that seemed to creep through the walls. She could hear the soft thump of footsteps above her, though she knew she was alone. And then came the voice, clearer now, persistent, calling her name in the low, melodic tone of a child's plea. Clara! Desperation and fear wove together in her chest, and she returned to the attic with a lantern, illuminating every shadow. The room seemed alive, pulsing and breathing with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. The portrait hung on the wall as if it had always been there, yet the girl's presence was overwhelming now, palpable in the air, pressing against her chest. The reverse aging continued, the girl's form shrinking, becoming smaller, younger with each passing minute. And as she watched, Clara felt herself pulled into the portrait, her reflection in the mirror twisting further, blending with the girl's form. Days turned into nights with little distinction. Clara's once orderly life was consumed by the haunting presence. She could no longer leave the attic without feeling the girl's eyes searing into her back. Meals went untouched, calls from friends went unanswered, and the line between dream and waking blurred so thoroughly that she could no longer trust her own perceptions. Shadows moved with intention, whispers followed her from room to room, and every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, polished floors, mocked her with a distorted version of herself that was sometimes the girl and sometimes something worse. Her obsession grew. She cleaned the portrait, polished its glass frame, and spoke to it in low whispers, hoping to understand the girl, to find the reason for the torment. But no answers came. Only the shifting features, the giggles, the cries, the silent, intelligent stare that refused to let her rest. Her journals, once filled with everyday observations, became frantic scripts detailing every motion of the girl's eyes, every movement of objects, every sound in the house that had once been simple and benign. One evening, as the storm's fury reached its apex, Clara found herself staring at the portrait longer than ever before. Lightning illuminated the attic, revealing details she had never noticed. The faint scars of brush strokes that seemed to writhe, subtle textures in the paint that hinted at flesh beneath, and the almost imperceptible shimmer of tears glistening on the girl's painted cheeks. And then, impossibly, the girl smiled, a small, knowing, chilling expression that was both childlike and ancient. The next moments blurred together in a whirlwind of terror and fascination. Clara felt herself pulled forward, the boundaries between the canvas and reality dissolving. She reached for the portrait, and when her fingers brushed the surface, the glass seemed liquid, sucking her in with the cold inevitability of night. The room spun, the storm outside roared with triumph, and she felt herself shrinking, flattening, becoming two-dimensional as she merged with the painted girl. When dawn finally broke, the rain had stopped, and the sun cast pale light into the attic. The house was silent. On the wall, a new portrait had appeared, framed in gold and ornate carvings as if it had always belonged there. The girl in the blue dress stared outward, her eyes dark and knowing, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. In her reflection on the glass, one could almost see the shadow of Clara, trapped forever in the liminal space between paint and flesh, whispering softly, calling a name that no one would hear. From that day forward, those who entered the house reported a feeling of being watched. Some swore they heard the soft giggles of a child in the empty attic, or caught glimpses of movement from the corner of their eyes. And in the rain on stormy nights, some claimed the portrait aged and shrank before their eyes, as if the girl, and the woman who had become her, were living a life trapped in reverse, bound by the obsession, the distorted reality, and the quiet, unrelenting madness of a haunted soul. Clara's existence became an echo, a story written in brush strokes and shadow, a cautionary tale that the curious and the lonely sometimes stumble upon the wrong door in the attic and never truly return. Even now, when the house creaks in the night or a faint giggle drifts through an empty hallway, the portrait waits patiently, the eyes always following, always knowing, always hungry for the next watcher who dares linger too long. Story number 3. The village lay hidden in the folds of a valley, shrouded in mist even on the clearest of days. It was the kind of place travelers avoided, not for its size or beauty, but because of the stories whispered among its few residents. They spoke of a bell that tolled at midnight, a sound that no one dared trace too closely, for those who heard it often vanished without a trace. Some said the bell had a voice of its own, calling the guilty and the sorrowful alike to their doom. Others claimed it was a curse, bound to the tower that had stood abandoned for generations, its stones darkened by the weight of unseen grief. The stories were so persistent that the villagers rarely ventured near the old bell tower, leaving it to the winds and the shadow of legend. Among the few outsiders drawn to the village was a young scholar named Elias. He had spent years studying folklore, myths, and the faint traces of forgotten rituals. The story of the self-tolling bell had captured his imagination like no other, and he arrived in the village under the pretense of research, though curiosity, and something deeper, darker, propelled him. From the moment he stepped into the misty streets, Elias felt the weight of expectation, as though unseen eyes measured his every movement. The villagers were polite but distant, their eyes betraying a fear they could not, or would not, explain. On his first night, Elias heard the bell. Its toll was not loud, nor was it resonant like the chimes of a church. It was hollow, each strike a slow, deliberate echo that seemed to vibrate through his bones. He rose from his bed, heart hammering in a mixture of fear and fascination, and looked out the window toward the silhouette of the abandoned tower. Moonlight revealed its jagged outline, and for a moment, the air felt charged, as though the very atmosphere waited for him to move. Without hesitation, he wrapped himself in a coat and set off down the cobblestone streets, guided by the haunting sound. The village was silent, almost unnaturally so. Doors were closed, windows shuttered, and even the wind seemed cautious, flowing softly through the empty lanes. As Elias approached the tower, he noticed the faint, intricate carvings on its stone walls, faces twisted in silent agony, hands outstretched in eternal pleading. He shivered, a sense of foreboding crawling up his spine, but curiosity pushed him forward. The wooden door at the base of the tower hung slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay and time itself. The staircase spiraled upward, tight and steep, carved directly into the stone. Each step groaned under his weight, as though protesting his intrusion. The bell's tolling continued, more insistent now, almost conversational in its rhythm. As Elias climbed, a strange sensation overtook him. The air thickened, and the shadows cast by his lantern seemed to stretch unnaturally, forming shapes that hinted at memories he had long tried to forget. He saw, for an instant, the face of his childhood friend who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Another turn revealed the room where his first heartbreak had left him hollow, the sorrow and regret painted vividly against the stone walls. At first, he thought it was exhaustion, a trick of the mind amplified by the eerie silence and the cold stone. But the visions persisted, growing more vivid with each step. Whispers began to thread through the air, faint and almost melodic, carrying secrets Elias had never shared with a soul. They spoke of failures, betrayals, and sins buried deep in his conscience. Every memory, every pang of regret, was drawn up by the bell itself, as though it had become aware of his presence and was assessing his worth, or perhaps savoring his suffering. By the time Elias reached the halfway mark of the tower, his legs trembled, and his mind teetered on the brink of panic. The spiral staircase seemed endless, a labyrinth designed not just to reach a physical height, but to climb through layers of fear and remorse. Yet he could not stop. Something compelled him forward, a mixture of dread and fascination, as though the bell promised him the answers he sought. He had spent his life chasing knowledge, chasing mysteries that others deemed unworthy of pursuit, and now here in the darkness of the ancient tower, the ultimate secret awaited. With each toll, the bell's presence grew heavier. Shadows began to detach themselves from the walls, swirling around him, forming ephemeral figures that mimicked people he had known and lost. He saw the stern face of his father, the gentle smile of a mentor, the cold glance of rivals, all distorted and exaggerated by the bell's influence. Each apparition whispered his failures and fears, pressing him closer to the brink of madness. Elias forced himself to breathe, to ground himself in reason, but reason seemed to dissolve in the damp, oppressive air. Finally he reached the top of the tower. The door to the belfry was massive, blackened with age, and carved with symbols that seemed to writhe when he looked at them directly. As he pushed it open, a sudden stillness greeted him. The bell hung suspended in the center, larger than he had imagined, its bronze surface dulled and scratched by centuries of neglect. Yet it exuded a presence, a consciousness, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The tolling had stopped, but in the silence, he felt its awareness pressing against his mind, probing, hungry. The belfry itself seemed alive. The air pulsed with a strange energy, and Elias could sense the memories and regrets of countless others who had come before him, all drawn to the bell's call. It was not merely a bell. It was an entity ancient and sentient, feeding on sorrow and despair. And now it had noticed him. Elias stepped closer, compelled and terrified. As he reached out, the bell vibrated softly, a tone that resonated directly within his chest. Visions flooded his mind. Faces of those who had vanished, screams echoing through time, lives consumed by their own hidden regrets. The bell did not merely toll. It absorbed. It drew the essence of those who came near, leaving emptiness behind. Elias felt the pull, a sensation of being unwound from the very fabric of reality. He tried to step back to flee, but the belfry shifted subtly, as though the stones themselves had learned to trap him. A voice, deep and resonant, seemed to emerge from the bell, speaking not in words, but in a torrent of emotion that filled him with sorrow and fear. It showed him his own life, magnified through a lens of loss and regret, until each failure seemed unbearable. And then, it whispered of the promise of eternity, an eternal presence, if only he allowed himself to be absorbed. Elias' knees buckled. His heart pounded like the tolling he had heard so many nights before. The temptation was immense. He could feel the weight of every sorrow he had ever known, every mistake, every missed opportunity, and the bell offered a release, a merging into something greater than himself. Yet, within that terror, a spark of defiance ignited. He realized that knowledge had brought him here, and perhaps knowledge could be his salvation. He tore his gaze from the bell and looked at the floor beneath him, at the fragile wooden beams, at the empty night sky glimpsed through cracks in the tower. With a sudden surge of will, Elias took a step backward, then another, descending as the bell vibrated angrily, a sound that rattled the very air. Shadows clawed at him, the whispers reaching a deafening crescendo, but he did not falter. Step by step, he descended the spiral staircase, the bell's fury echoing behind him, threatening to pull him back. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he pushed onward, driven by instinct and the faint hope of escape. Finally, he emerged at the base of the tower. The bell's presence seemed to withdraw, leaving behind a faint hum that lingered in his chest. The village was still and quiet, mist curling around the cobblestones like smoke. Elias fell to his knees, gasping for breath, overwhelmed by relief and lingering terror. He knew he had survived something ancient and malevolent, a force that had claimed countless others before him. He left the village the following morning, taking care not to speak of what had occurred. The villagers greeted him politely, as if nothing had changed, but he knew better. The bell still tolled at midnight, still claiming the sorrowful, the guilty, and the curious. Elias would never forget the sensation of the bell's awareness, the taste of despair it had offered him, and the shadow of those who had vanished into its eternal toll. Though he carried on with his life, studying and teaching, he found sleep elusive. At times, he would hear the faint echo of a bell in the distance, and memories of the tower would rise unbidden, filling his mind with unease. He realized that knowledge came at a price. Some mysteries were not meant to be unraveled, and some legends were warnings, not invitations. And yet, even knowing the danger, he could not help but feel a subtle lingering pull toward the bell, a curiosity that whispered in the quietest moments, tempting him back into the darkness. For the bell waits. It waits for the sorrowful, the regretful, the curious. It waits for those willing to confront the shadows of their own past, offering a union with its ancient, merciless consciousness. And one day, perhaps, another young scholar will hear the midnight toll, feel the irresistible call, and step forward, just as Elias once did. The bell will toll, and the shadows will stir, welcoming a new soul into the eternal chorus of lost memories and whispered regrets. Story number 4. The fog rolled in thick and unyielding, curling around the narrow cobblestone streets like the fingers of a restless ghost. I had arrived in the town just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last light struggling to pierce the grey haze. From the very first moment, I felt the air heavy with secrets, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Buildings leaned into one another, their windows dark and unwelcoming. Not a soul stirred. The quiet was so absolute that my own footsteps echoed like gunshots against the empty walls. I wandered without purpose, drawn by some nameless curiosity, until I came upon a narrow alley that seemed older than the rest, cobbles uneven, stones slick with damp, and walls slick with moss. At the alley's end stood a library unlike any I had ever seen. Its doors were tall, carved from dark wood that gleamed faintly under the shrouded moonlight. I noticed at once that the building was surrounded by shallow water, the fog resting upon it like a thin, silvery veil. Yet when I stepped closer, I realized that the water never lapped against the doors, never soaked the threshold. It was as if the library existed in its own separate reality, a place both submerged and untouched, a paradox of stillness and movement. A strange chill ran down my spine, but something compelled me forward. I pushed the heavy doors open. They groaned in protest, a low, human-like moan that seemed to echo throughout the entire structure. Inside, the air smelled of damp paper and old ink, yet it carried no hint of mold or decay. The water outside seemed to vanish entirely. The floor beneath me was dry and firm, the library defying every law of nature. I stepped further in, and immediately I felt a peculiar sensation, as if the very walls were breathing, the shelves expanding and contracting like lungs. The books on them were countless, more than I had ever imagined, their spines gleaming in the dim, flickering light. I reached out to touch a nearby volume and I froze. A faint whisper drifted into my ears, just at the edge of comprehension. It was a voice, or perhaps many voices, speaking in a language I could not recognize. My heart began to race, but I could not pull away. As if drawn by some invisible current, I wandered deeper into the labyrinth of shelves. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, yet still incomprehensible. Pages fluttered on their own, turning in gentle, deliberate motions, revealing glimpses of strange symbols, indecipherable diagrams, and fragments of stories that twisted and writhed before my eyes. Time became meaningless. I had no sense of how long I had been walking, no awareness of night or day, only the quiet, persistent whispers and the endless, wet labyrinth of books. I felt the water outside pressing in through the walls, or perhaps it was my mind imagining it. It was as if I were drowning, not in liquid, but in the vast, unknowable ocean of knowledge the library offered. Each volume I touched seemed to tug at me, calling me closer, insisting that I read, remember, understand, yet my mind rebelled. The more I tried, the less I comprehended. Images flashed behind my eyes. Faces I did not know, scenes I had never witnessed, words that burned with meaning I could not grasp. The library was alive, and it was feeding on me. At some point I realized I was no longer simply reading. I was being absorbed. My body felt heavier, as if the floor itself was pulling me down, dragging me toward some hidden depth. The air grew thick with the scent of wet pages and old ink, intoxicating and suffocating at once. I tried to turn back to find the entrance, but the doors had vanished. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, and the whispers became a chorus, insistent, pleading, commanding. I was no longer certain whether the sound came from the books or from inside my own head. Panic surged, and I ran blindly, shoving through narrow aisles, only to find myself back where I had started, staring at the same row of volumes that had first caught my attention. One book in particular drew me like a magnet. Its cover was dark, the leather warm to the touch, and when I opened it, I felt a shock ripple through my chest. The pages were blank, yet the words appeared as I stared, forming and dissolving like ink on water. I could not read them fully, yet I understood their message in some deep, instinctual way. The library was a trap, a living entity, and I had become part of it. My mind, once clear and steady, now felt porous, leaking into the books, seeping into the very fabric of the library. Each whisper, each fluttering page, carried a piece of me away, until I feared I would exist only as knowledge, a memory trapped in paper and ink, forever receding from my own understanding. Hours or perhaps days passed, or perhaps I imagined the passage of time. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat, absorbed by the library. I attempted to flee, to force my way through walls or shelves, but the corridors shifted around me, turning back on themselves, folding space in ways that defied reason. I realized with a cold certainty that the library would not release me. It had claimed me, and it would not let go. In desperation, I clutched a single volume to my chest, hoping that by holding on to something familiar, I might anchor myself, retain some shred of identity. Yet the book resisted me, its pages writhing in my hands, pulling at my fingers, slipping away. A whisper rose above the rest, sharper, clearer, though I still could not comprehend the words. And then, with a sickening clarity, I understood. This was not just a place of books. It was a living mind, and it would add mine to its own. My thoughts, memories, experiences, everything that made me me, would be folded into the vast, incomprehensible knowledge it contained. The last thing I felt before the final, irreversible pull was the cold press of the shelves closing around me, the sensation of being lifted, rearranged, catalogued. My body stiffened, my limbs became heavy, my skin felt like pages. And then I was still. Now, if someone were to wander into that fog-laden town and stumble upon the library, they might notice a single new volume on one of the middle shelves, its spine dark and unmarked, waiting silently. If they opened it, they would find pages that whispered their own incomprehensible language, as if a voice from another mind were calling to them. And in those whispers, faint and distant, I could feel myself still trapped, still aware, still drowning in knowledge I can never fully grasp, a prisoner of the library's impossible waters, forever another volume, another story without an end. The fog outside rolls on, thick and unyielding. The town sleeps, or perhaps it only pretends to, hiding its secret in plain sight. And the library waits, patient and eternal, ready to claim any who come too close, feeding quietly on the curious and the unknowing. For the library is not a building, nor merely a collection of books. It is a living, breathing consciousness, vast and indifferent, and it cannot be escaped. I am still here. I am still aware. I am still drowning.